You make a really good case in The Origins of Virtue that virtue itself, that morality itself has a biological basis, and that it's grounded in our evolutionary history. And I'll let you, if you would, I'd ask you to expound on that a little bit. You talk about the discovery of the future and the necessity of reciprocity as driving agents in that evolution. And it's a wonderful idea. And it's a profound idea, because it does hint at a non-arbitrary base for moral thinking. And I think that's been something I've been pursuing my entire life, I would say. But
well, what I set out to do in that book, and it is admittedly 26 years ago or something that I finished writing it, so I may have changed my mind on one or two things. But what I set out to do was to persuade the reader that our good instincts are as animal as our bad instincts, or our good behavior is as natural, is as instinctive, if you like, as our bad behavior. We tend to get, I think from Christianity mainly, a view that there's a deep sort of animal side of us which is bad, but we can teach each other to be good. And I don't think that's right. I think there's just as much of an animal instinct to be good in us as there is bad. Because if you look at, we are a social species. Lots of species are very social. And what they tend to do is they express various forms of kindness and generosity and self-sacrifice towards other members of their species. The most obvious example is that we're nice to our children, as are most creatures. And the reason we're nice to our children is obviously because we share their genes. People who were nice to their children tended to leave more children behind than people who weren't nice to their children. And so the genes for being nice to children thrived at the expense of genes that did the opposite. But obviously it goes further than that. There are social species that collaborate with other ones, and they do so often with a form of, that collaborate with strangers, as it were. And they do so often with a form of reciprocity. You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. I'll be nice to you today, you'll be nice to me tomorrow. When a fish visits a cleaner station on the reef and allows small fish to clean the parasites off it, it's resisting the temptation to eat the cleaner fish. And so there's a mutual gain from trade there.
Yeah, that's a remarkable example, that these cleaning stations are set up on coral reefs where small fish congregate, often brightly colored, and large fish line up like cars at a gas station to have their scales and even their teeth denuded of parasites and dying tissue. And some of those cleaning stations are apparently tens of thousands of years old. So
yes, that's what, and of course that's a cross-species collaboration. This is two different species collaborating. But I don't know whether it's in that book or later. I in the end come down on to the view that that kind of reciprocity, you scratch my back, I scratch yours, is surprisingly rare, actually. That actually you can't find that many examples. There's a wonderful example of vampire bats doing it. Vampire bats that didn't get a blood meal beg for one from their neighbor. The neighbor then, you then return the favor to the neighbor next time that he doesn't get a blood meal. And that way you're both better off. Actually, it turned out that they were closely related. This was to some degree a family thing as well. So actually, and in human beings, it isn't very common for me to say, look, you did me a favor yesterday, so I'm going to do you the same favor today. What are the circumstances under which that's going to happen? I'm going to have too much food today and you're going to have too much food tomorrow. It's kind of doesn't happen very often. But we human beings have developed another form of exchange, which is far more powerful, which is I've got more food than I need, you've got more water than you need, I'm thirsty, you're hungry, we'll come to a deal, we'll swap. So we'll swap different things at the same time rather than the same things at different times. And for me, that's the real insight into how human sociality and cooperation evolved. Now, I'm only here repeating what Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations about the butcher and the baker are not giving you bread and beer because they want to be kind to you. They're doing it to make a living. But they end up being kind to you, and you end up being kind to them by giving them money, which is what they want.
Well, I also thought that in some sense you made a deeper case than that too, talking about the human capacity to understand and envision the future. I mean, reciprocity requires the ability to view transactions across time. And so as soon as a creature becomes aware of the future, like we have, we can even engage in reciprocal behavior with our future selves. And that makes our self-interest a much more complex phenomenon. So I might define self-interest as the impulsive pursuit of pleasure. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable definition, perhaps when you're talking about animals. But the question immediately arises, pleasure over what time span and at what cost? And I'm compelled by my knowledge of the future to act in a way that doesn't betray my future self. And that's very much like acting so then I'm a collective that stretches across time as an individual, and I have to act in the best interests of that collective. And I don't think that's very different than acting in the best interests of other people. If I'm in my last book, I wrote about the morality that emerges from games. There's a neuroscientist who you might be familiar with, Jaak Panksepp, who studied rat behavior in games. And he showed that if you pair two male juvenile rats together, the one with a 10% body weight advantage will pin the other almost 100% of the time. And you might say, well, what that demonstrates is that might makes right. The stronger animal wins. But if you pair them together repeatedly, after the first bout, the defeated rat, juvenile, has to be the inviter of play in the next match. So he'll invite the bigger rat to play. But over repeated pairings, unless the big rat lets the little rat win about 30% of the time, the little rat will stop inviting him to play.
Right.
So what happens is that you get an emergent morality, which is not the ability to win any given game, but the ability to repeatedly play a multitude of games. And there's something in that that's very much like what you wrote about in The Origin of Virtue, and something very much like a complex reciprocity. Right, so where you store your good behavior in your reputation, essentially, and that's of great advantage.